Hi everyone, number one Marmaduke fan here. A while ago I talked about Punisher the Platoon issues 1 and 2 together, and I think I titled that Punisher the Platoon needs to stop comparing me to communists, and I made the argument that it felt like there was a little SJW agenda in Punisher the Platoon as much as I liked it, kind of this vibe that America and the communist Vietnamese were morally equivalent, or maybe the Americans were worse. And I think there was some valid criticism in that argument. But having read 3 and 4, I think my confidence has been restored, and I don't know if I rescind everything I said in that first video, but I am excited for Punisher the Platoon, and it's assuaged some of my fears and concerns. Where I think this is a really good story. This has kind of reaffirmed me that this is one of the best comics that Marvel Comics is producing. Problem is, Marvel has produced a lot of crap in the past year, so this is, by comparison to that, this is great. I think even if just on its own merits compared to some of my favorite comics from my childhood, I would still find this to be a really good comic. If, a blunt and in your face, not for kids comic. So, hey parents, explicit content, all right? Don't get this one for the kiddies. Oh, the thing I wanted to say is, I'm not a military guy, and I'm not a Punisher fan. It feels a little weird, watching comic book videos. Is so many of the channels I come across, these are military guys, and they talk about, reading comic books and their military experience, and they connect it to these characters. I don't know if you can tell this, guys, but I'm the type of dude who, if I went into the military recruitment office for the draft, they'd take one look at me and say, "Yeah, you're too small. Go back in the lake. Go eat a few cheeseburgers." So I've got no personal experience I can draw from to talk about war comics, except just reading about war and reading about war and history, and loving learning about the history of war. When it comes to war in fictional stories, there are two extremes I don't like. I don't kind of like hoorah, yippee-ki-yay, hey kids, go to your nearest recruitment office kind of stories. And I don't like kind of dreary, nihilistic, America was never great kind of stories. And most war stories that are fictional that I read fall into one of those two categories. Either it's like super adventure time in Vietnam. Well, actually not that much in Vietnam, but it's either like a super adventure where they make it look like a fun, bouncy adventure with the dudes, or it's a dark and gritty, every other scene they're murdering a bunch of children. And there's a little bit of that in Punisher the Platoon, but what I think this is an example of is, even if Ennis may be on the left in his perspective on the war, he is smart enough to allow multiple kinds of perspectives to just be voiced in his story. So I'm going to recommend you go over to Comic Book University for his videos on 3 and 4. He kind of gives you the story. He gives you his own perspective on it. That's what I watched before doing these videos, because I didn't want to be redundant. But I do have a few of my own thoughts on the art of the medium and how it's paced. So pretty much in 1 and 2, Frank Castle, who will later become the Punisher, shows up in Vietnam, and he's established as this kind of very noble, very concerned lieutenant who wants to get all his men out alive and is willing to bend the rules a bit to make that happen. And 3 opens... 2 ended with them surviving this terrible assault on their bunker, and Castle single-handedly taking out a Vietnamese gunner and grabbing the machine gun and just ripping through everybody. The violence is pretty graphic. 3 opens with the soldiers having trouble with these new guns that jam all the time, and Castle wants to get some of the old guns. I think it's the M16s is what he wants. What is it? The M16s are the ones that are jamming, and he wants the older issue that the men are used to, M14. He wants to get a whole bunch of M14s, because that's what the soldiers were trained on, and they don't jam. So Castle has this idea that he's going to kind of play around with the black market to get them. Now, what I love about this guy is that in every panel he's drawn in, he's got sort of this shit-eating grin. He looks a little sneaky, and he looks like a charming, BS artist. And that's conveyed in every expression that he has. There he is again. See? So this idea of a very simple character we don't get to see much of. Expression is used to convey what type of personality he is. And then Frank Castle has this very interesting kind of double entendre conversation with this guy about how Castle needs to get these M14s and how he can help this guy get AK-47s in exchange to sell kind of on the down low. And his sergeant Castle's brought his sergeant along on this trip, and the sergeant sells for us, who, if you don't quite get what's going on, the expression sells the idea that Castle is playing fast and loose with the rules because he believes he has to do this to get his men through Vietnam alive. He is committed to keeping his men alive, and he's breaking some of the rules as a lieutenant to get that to happen. This I freaking love, this whole exchange. So after they make a deal, then Castle says, Scuttlebutt says there's heroin going around. Why, I'm as shocked as you are, sir. It doesn't come anywhere near 861. Right. Be seeing you. I love this. This is a while ago I talked about like Jane Austen and how all the stories in Jane Austen are sort of these clever ballroom conversations between English gentlefolk, and their words always mean their conversation always has layers of meaning to it. This is great. So they've had this conversation about the illegal stuff that Castle wants to do. He floats the idea that there's heroin around, and then just says it doesn't come anywhere near 861. So he's saying it in a way that says, this could just be conversational. Yeah, there are no drugs near 861. But what he's really saying is, you keep the drugs away from my men. And look at this contrast in the drawing. A zoomed-in close-up of Frank Castle where we see every whisker on his face, and we see the sergeant's surprised expression. And then a comedic expression on the slimy guy. Fantastic. The art is serving the story. It's generally kind of this simple, elegant line style, but then when it needs to, it'll zoom in and give you some details, and it'll zoom out and do some comedy. And lots of strong compositions, lots of strong shadows. Who is this? Parlov. Parlov is solid. So this whole scene just knocked my socks off. And then things like this. So this doctor who was a former soldier, he wishes they'd drop more bombs on Vietnam. So that's what I was looking for. I was looking for examples of, even if Ennis himself is a critic of Vietnam, it makes sense for some of the characters who are Vietnamese soldiers to be pro-Vietnam War. That kind of makes sense to me. If one's against the war, then one or two should be for the war, or kind of hoorah America about their experience in the military. So, and I got it. So the criticism that I had of the first two issues is being addressed here. Some of the characters, there's diversity amongst the characters in how they think about the war and how they talk about the war, and this is great. It sets up the next issue by having the Vietnamese general kind of make observations on how it makes sense for the Americans to bomb us. They have the technology to do it. And then he's continuing to pressure this sniper lady into becoming an officer, and she's hesitant to do it because she seems to have this personal hatred for the Americans. And then I didn't like the ending of this one. It ends with them getting their guns back, the M14s, and then they see a Vietnamese soldier out in the field, and Castle says, well, let's test what we got. And it just ends with a Vietnamese soldier getting shot. I guess they're kind of evoking the idea that Castle's slowly getting better. He started off a little bit green behind the ear, wet behind the ears, and not sure what to do in the first two issues, but he learned quickly and commanded the attention. He started commanding the respect of his men quickly. And so he misses, he gets a little too high, and then he nails it. So Castle misses twice, but then he gets it on the third one. So it's like they're foreshadowing how he's going to become the evil vigilante Punisher. I just thought this was a little bit of a, anticlimax after everything else that happened before. Issue 4. So just to be clear, I'm saying go watch Comic Book University for his excellent summary of the stories of these videos. I really just want to give you like the highs and lows that stuck out to me as I read, and some great artistic moments. There's some great storytelling moments in this one. So this one starts with all the guys, trying to pick up Vietnamese hookers, and they're laughing about it. They're joking about how stupid they were and how, they were trusting in their angel, essentially. And an American lieutenant has been captured by the Vietnamese, and she just holds up a bunch of dog tags to show that she killed a bunch of people. And meanwhile, Castle and his sergeant are having a conversation about how they're both family men, and there's this really sweet moment where the sergeant's talking about how, even if his wife never finds out, he knows that if he cheats on her, that'll be it. He has this sort of premonition that it'll be over between him and his wife if he cheats on her, even if she never finds out. I like this. They're humanizing this character and giving him some like maturity and some positive masculinity. And Castle and him talk about the nature of Vietnam and how it has an effect on some people's minds. So the sergeant is worried that Frank Castle is going to fall in love with being in Vietnam and become obsessed with being in Vietnam like a drug. I'm pretty much borrowing that idea directly from Comic Book University, and I think he's right. This is setting up the idea that Castle loves this. He says it calls to something within me. Castle loves being this strong, in command military type, and he's really good at it. It answers something in me. That's all. So the Sarge is scared for Castle that when all the experienced soldiers leave, Castle's just going to have a bunch of idiot newbies come in, and he's not going to be able to shoulder this same burden. Castle wants every single one of his men to come home alive, even though he doesn't really understand what they're supposed to be doing in Vietnam. This is another great moment. So this American Marine has been captured. He's a lieutenant. He's spilling all the beans to the Viet Cong about troop morale, and he mentions Walter Cronkite and the effect Walter Cronkite had on how Americans perceived the war in Vietnam. But then he kind of bites back a bit and says, I know, but I know we held Khe Sanh. I know we kicked you out of Saigon. I know we took back Hue. There's just no way you people aren't hurting. But I think about the folks back home, and I know none of it means a damn thing. So what's interesting about this is floating the idea that America was actually winning the war in Vietnam. And the problem was we were losing the war in the American news section. We were losing the American people on their perception of the war, even as we were blowing up the enemy left and right. So I liked hearing that idea expressed, even if it's in the voice of a character who's kind of spilling his guts without doing any pushback. He just gives the reason that I'm not stupid. Basically, I talk to you with or without being beaten half to death. So even though he's a bit of a coward and that he's given in right away, I do the same thing in his position. I'm sorry. I don't know if I have it in me to get my teeth kicked in and then end up talking anyway. But I liked hearing this perspective attributed to him. It's not all like anti-war, nihilistic, pessimistic characters. There's a variety of perspectives on the war. This is the best scene in issue 4. So summa spoilerum, summa tangentum, summa triggerum. Go get this book. The men are in the bar, and they're talking about how they're broke and they want to go get a whore, and a Green Beret spots them, and he is ticked off. He's apparently mad at the whole Marine Corps, and since they're Marines, he blames them. And a fight is about to brew. I even like this bit. This is a good use of swearing, I think, in a war comic, right? So it's not just swearing for the sake of being edgy. It's swearing for the sake of realism when, it's a bunch of guys in a terrible situation about to get beat up. Gleed, are they? Well, here's a clue. They're wearing bleeping green berets. Yeah, it's great. Just in case you didn't notice that as the audience, they're now helping you understand the fear of the characters who are about to get in this fight. Castle walks in. He just says, "Control your men, Sergeant. What'd you bleeping say?" And then he started moving. And they all remember their impression of Castle and his masculinity. This is a heroic moment for Frank Castle. And what's important about this for me as someone who has hated the character of the Punisher is that Punisher the Platoon is setting up Frank Castle as a noble character with many positive traits. Preparation, command, physical courage. He is willing to bend the rules, so it's not like he's the most morally principled person, but his primary moral goal is to protect his men's lives, so he bends the rules for the sake of keeping his men alive. So that's the morality that's guiding his actions, and it's guiding him here as he defends his men from a Green Beret and just walks right up to him. Masculinity. Yes, I want masculinity in my comics. And then the guy just sort of like, bleep, bleep. And then Castle just tells him, I have no answers for your problems. Go and sleep it off. And then Castle tells his men to the NVA, a combat loss is a combat loss. Doesn't matter if it's a bullet or the Sith. He's referring to syphilis because these men were trying to get whores who probably would have given them a deadly disease. So this is a story about Frank Castle winning the respect of other men, through his force of will and through his dedication to his work. This is great. I love this. I love this portrayal of masculinity, and I've had some people share tweets with me of Warren Ellis kind of having like a I don't know, anti-capitalist, the American military-industrial complex view of war, which is a bit annoying to me in storytelling. But because Ennis is actually a writer, he's able to give multiple perspectives to his characters, and he's able to convey the heroism and the courage of people in war, and he's able to strike a fine balance between two extremes of making it too lovey-dovey, happy-sappy, adventure-y, and not paying attention to the horrors of war, and he's staying away from it just being a negative pessimist fest of, oh, we Americans, shame on us, we're so terrible, boo hoo hoo. This is great. So I was so happy with issue 4. I'm now excited about Punisher the Platoon again, and I cannot wait to go get issue 5, and I'll be getting the trade paperback. One of the best. I would have loved this comic years ago when Marvel was at its height. I love this comic now. Go get it. Even if you are not a big Punisher person, I was not a big Punisher person, and this is making me interested in the Punisher. Good on you, Ennis. Love you guys. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. Why don't you like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notifications, and I'll catch you later.